there was no bank on either side of the road, not when I bought it, but originally the road was on top at ground level. And over the 100 and something years or 150 years that people have lived here, that's how much erosion has occurred. And that's a relatively flat section of road. To me, this road is in pretty good shape now since I've been working on it. If you notice, it's crowned, the center's high, and the edges are low. So the idea is to get the runoff to go off in the ditches. And if you look down at the very end of the picture, it's kind of hard to see. You can see there's a berm down there. And when the runoff from the two ditches hits that berm, I took a backhoe and dug an exit out there. And so the dirt is spilled out into the woods rather than into continuing to go down the driveway. Because as the old equation, Einstein's or somebody equation goes, it's force equals mass times velocity squared. So the longer you let water run down a road, the more force it attains, and the greater amount of disturbance it causes. On our national forest system as a whole, there is 380,000 miles of roads on the 194 million acres of Forest Service land. The Forest Service has a $10 billion backlog of road maintenance. This was in 2003, according to the group Taxpayers for Common Sense. It's a conservative group that I pay attention to. I haven't seen any recent calculations about the road maintenance backlog, but I would assume if it was 10 billion in 2003, it's probably close to 20 billion by now. To give you an idea of the magnitude of that, the Forest Service has a budget of $6 billion, which has remained stagnant for about the past 20 years. Their budget really hasn't increased. And half of the budget goes for firefighting. And I learned an interesting thing in calling around and talking to some of the officials in the Chattahoochee, and that is that they're so strapped for salary money that people get detailed out to firefighting details out west, not because they're needed to fight fires, but because their salary is picked up out of the fire budget instead of the normal Chattahoochee budget, which is not a very good way to run an organization. Under the second Bush administration, the Government Accounting Office issued a report saying they didn't understand what the 30,000 people who work for the Forest Service did and how anyone could understand their budget. Their budget's one of the more complicated pieces of accounting apparently in the world. I'm going to throw up some more slides, and as I put a slide up, I'll talk about it. If I can get my apparatus to work here. Here we go. There's supposed to be a 4-second lag. This is Forest Service Road 665-1, which loops in right underneath Springer Mountain, the terminus of the Appalachian Trail. It comes off the Nimberville Gap Road 28-2. That's my bird dog out ahead of me there. I was hunting down this road. As you'll notice, the stream that comes down doesn't go in the culvert underneath the road anymore. Instead, it runs down the center of the road. So this is a beginning of a collapse of this road. After a 4-year or 5-year campaign to get this road gated, it's a dead-end road. It doesn't serve any purpose at all. There's a nice waterfall at the end of the road if you walk off the road, but it serves no transportation need. I managed to convince the Forest Service to gate the road, and the gate was promptly torn down. The gate was put back up. Then someone used one of the new modern battery-powered metal cutters to cut the tang off the lock. So the gate lay on the ground for another 2 years. Finally got back up, and I pleaded with them to go ahead and cut a bunch of trees down behind the gate. It would make it unappealing to tear the gate down if you had trees behind it. And when I went to inspect what happened, they had cut one tree down. So it remains to be seen how long this is, if the gate's still up or if the tree's down. One of the problems with checking this road out is that Forest Service Road 28-2, a major highway, which I'll talk about later, or at one time a major thoroughfare, is in such bad shape that even in my trusty high ground clearance four-wheel drive older model 4Runner, I'm very hesitant to go up the road. Not so much because I don't think I can make it, I probably can, but it's just so darn uncomfortable. Moving on to another slide here. This is the complement to Road 665-1, this Road 665. It comes off the Ridge Road or Forest Service Road 42, which is the way you would get to Springer Mountain and the terminus, the Appalachian Trail. At one time, the Forest Service had ideas that they would connect this road 665 with 665-1, and they would have joined right below Springer Mountain. That was back during the clear cutting days when they couldn't build roads fast enough. But as you can see, the water is running down the center of the road. The road prism is gone. It's not, it doesn't make a nice crown. The ditch, there's no ditches on either side. The water's eating the road away. And this road will ultimately, or already is almost impassable, but it'll do nothing but get worse and worse. My efforts to get this road closed, my efforts being asking the ranger to close it, have gotten nowhere. This is an abandoned vehicle that was trying to navigate the prior road 665. The suspension collapsed on it and the vehicle was abandoned, and over time was kind of vandalized. People threw rocks through the window and ripped the interior out. I reported the car in there, and it took 4 years for them to get it out of there. The problem was they didn't have a budget item that would pay for abandoned car removal. So that, not very encouraging. This is a major Forest Service road. It's Forest Service Road 55. Andrew just made a survey of the road for me. And I'm not sure if that's his motorcycle or Nick Nichols, but anyway, this is a road that would provide the most convenient access, Forest Service access, from Dahlonega to Gooch Gap, Forest Service Road 42, the Appalachian Trail. And as you can see, the water is running down the center of the road. It's eating the road up. And I haven't tried to drive it, but Cliff Shaw, who's got a four-wheel drive Toyota truck, has driven the road for 20 years and told me the other day that he doesn't think he'd try it again. Sorry, I'm a little slow with the slides here. This is the road I alluded to before. It's Forest Service Road 28-2. It starts in the eastern part of Gilmer County, goes over Nimberville Gap and connects up with 28-1, which runs a good long while through the community of Nimberville and then eventually winds up by Camp Merrill. It was one of the original Forest Service, main Forest Service roads built by the CCC back in the 30s. I took this picture just the other day. I intended to get some pictures of a much worse section of the road, but there was a tree down across the road and I neglected to bring a saw with me. But as you can see, the water is running down the center of the road and it's eating the road up. There are tremendous ditches in this road further up. It's just barely, I just barely can make it through with my 4Runner. When I was a kid, my father drove me up this road in a Plymouth station wagon, and the mail used to run from Nimberville to the Bucktown community over this road because the roads in the eastern end of Gilmer County were so bad. This Forest Service road was much better shape. At one time, as it was starting to deteriorate, or it had deteriorated about 15 years ago when it was in the, I don't know what you'd call it, the major part of its deterioration, the culverts became exposed. So much material had washed off the road that the culverts, instead of being 18 or 24 inches under the ground, came to the surface of the ground. And one of the most difficult things difficult feats about driving the road was to manage to get over the top of the culverts. The Forest Service finally gave up on the culverts and everything else. And I guess about 10 years ago, they spent $25,000, put a guy named Bob Thomas in there. He's a good grading contractor with a D8 bulldozer. And he created these huge water dips. This is probably the first one on the road going up from the Gilmer County side. And Gilmer County side, they get closer and closer together as the road goes up. And of course, over time, the outlets of the road get dammed up. The silt dams the road up, so they become like little ponds. And the Jeepsters, these convoys of Jeeps now have discovered the road, and they're making mud bogs out of the what formerly were water bars. So I don't know what the future of this road is. It's impossible to repair it at this point in time. It would take hundreds and hundreds of truckloads of some kind of material, and the Forest Service just doesn't have the money for that. This is an example of a pretty good road. It's the McClure Creek Road. I think it's 796 over in the edge of the Cohuttas. And as you can see, it's kind of got a ditch on one side, and it's carrying the runoff from the road. But unfortunately, the runoff from the road is going right in the creek. When I built subdivision roads down in North Atlanta, predominantly in Gwinnett County, it was a requirement that the runoff from the roads didn't go in the nearest water body. Instead, they went into detention ponds. And the detention ponds were big enough to handle a good volume of water. The water would sit and the silt would drop out and clean water would flow over the top. The system's a pretty well designed system, but it requires that you actually clean the silt out of the detention ponds. And that, from what I can understand, in Gwinnett County and Fulton County and elsewhere where they have detention ponds, they're not being cleaned out. So the system, even though it's a good idea, is not functioning as it should. This is an article about the Tray Mountain Road, which a number of us worked on trying to get closed. We managed to get the eastern half of the road closed. It's one of the, I think it's Forest Service Road 79. It's a major road that I used to use before I moved to LJ back in the late 60s and early 70s. It was one of the easiest ways to get to a really wild section of the Appalachian Trail. But the eastern half of this road started to deteriorate. And then the Jeepsters, I call them, these convoys of Jeeps with incredibly rough tread tires, discovered the road and turned it into a mud bogging course. I kind of stirred up this article. The woman who wrote it, Debbie Gilbert, wrote several articles about ATV abuse and off-road vehicle abuse back when Brent Martin was the executive director, and so she's receptive to this kind of stuff. So soon after this article appeared in the paper, the Forest Service decided to close the eastern section of the road, which borders the Tray Mountain. What is the wilderness area there, Jess? Tray Mountain Wilderness. Yeah. So essentially, and then on the other side of the road is the Anna Ruby Falls scenic area. So with this half of the road closed, it's a good 4 or 5 miles, a section of road that's closed. It's really creating a nice addition to the, it's effectively a big addition to the wilderness area. But that's what it takes to get the Forest Service to move sometimes, an article like this in the newspaper. This is the western half of the Tray Mountain Road, which joins the eastern half at Tray Gap. Unfortunately, this can't be closed because there's several in-holdings, private property in there, and they have to have access. And what the Jeepsters have done, not satisfied with tearing the road up, they go off the road and create these mud bogs. And why adults would, I assume these people are adults, the vehicles they're driving cost anywhere from $50,000 to $70,000. They have enormously rough tires on them. And some of these vehicles come all the way up from Atlanta. I guess they have to wear earplugs because of the tire noise, but mud bogging is what they're all about. And they've just created a mess up there. This is an illegal road that runs through the below Coosa and the Coosa Scenic Area. Cliff Shaw discovered it the other day. I had noticed the turnoff on the Duncan Ridge Road a number of times, but I just went a little ways up it, and there was a dispersed campsite there, a hunter's campsite, and I assumed that that's all it was there, and I didn't think anything about it. But Cliff went a little bit further and walked it out and discovered this mess. This hooks around underneath Coosa Bald, right through the heart of the scenic area, and hooks up with Forest Service 108, which Cliff and I and the people in the Blue Ridge Ranger District have been going round and round about, mostly Cliff, trying to figure out whether this Forest Service Road 108 exists or is open or closed. There's quite a bit of confusion. The common map that's handed out that shows the road system, this map right here, if you can see it, I assume you can see it, doesn't have 108 on it, but when you go by the entrance to it, there's a gate on it and the gate's open. But we got word on, our Cliff got word yesterday that the road will be gated. And at some point in the future, perhaps they'll close the entrance to it. We put a sign up, one of the Carsonites, one of those narrow fiberglass signs saying, no motorized vehicles, but it'll probably get run over. They come back up. That's one advantage to these Carsonite signs. You can drive over them, they'll pop right back up. And I assume this was an old clear-cut road that when the Forest Service was clear-cutting on the north side of Duncan Ridge, they were hauling the timber. They use this road to haul timber to the end of 108. This is a shot from the Rich Mountain Road, which is an epic struggle that Georgia Forest Watch got involved with back in the early 2000s. The Forest Service bought the Rich Mountains in 1973. They paid $70 an acre for 13,000 acres. And it was part of the Rich Mountains became a wilderness area. Matter of fact, it's the wilderness area boundary is right behind my farm. This road's on the other side of the mountain. It never bothered or affected me. But when the Forest Service bought the land, this was an old timber road. It was constructed in the 40s and 50s to cut the timber in the Rich Mountains. And the Forest Service never summoned up the gumption or the courage, I guess you'd say, or the fortitude to close the road. And it became people came from all over the Southeast to ride the road, to mud bog. There were four-wheeler trails that went off in every direction into the wilderness area. It was a real mess. As you can see, this guy got a little bit too enthusiastic with his Jeep. He thought he could make it through the mud hole. Obviously, he couldn't. Georgia Forest Watch sued the Forest Service over this road. We managed to get the Forest Service kept saying they couldn't do anything about the road because Gilmer County had a claim on it. We had several members of our organization who were well connected legally. They got up with the county attorney and it pointed out to him that if Gilmer County made some claim on the road, then Gilmer County would be responsible for the environmental degradation that was going on. And so Gilmer County announced to the Forest Service that they had no claim on the road and that they had never advanced a claim on the road. And when we brought this news to the Forest Service, they said, well, Gilmer County needs to make a formal renouncement of the road. And we got them, suggested they read the disclaimer from Gilmer County that the county had never claimed the road to begin with. So we eventually had to sue the Forest Service, and they closed the road down for 2 years and studied what they were going to do. my hope was that the road would be closed and it would just be allowed to heal itself, maybe with some hay bales across it. But there was a congressman in Western North Carolina who some of the Forest Service staff officers knew, Charles Wilson, and they went to him and he appropriated $600,000 to rebuild the road. They wound up rebuilding half of it and shutting down half of it. I mean, it's much better today, but it's nothing like this. But as the Forest Service's own environmental analysis pointed out, the road was poorly designed, improperly located, and had slopes of 30%. It should never have been rebuilt. To give you an example, the runaway truck ramps come out if there's a 7% slope. And further up this road from where this picture was taken, you get 30% slopes. It continues to deteriorate, but the one saving grace in terms of maintaining this road is that it's in a wildlife management area, so the state chips in on it. And I think that may be all of my slides. Let me just see here. No, there's one more. Nope, that's a blank one. So anyway, the long and the short of it is, Andrew, am I out of time?
Yeah, that's about 20. You can go ahead and finish up the thought.
Yeah, I've got another couple of minutes if people can stand it. The Chattahoochee-Oconee National Forest budget for roads is about $1 million a year. I managed to talk to the staff officer in charge of the roads just yesterday, but he pointed out that of that $1 million, 800,000 goes to salaries and fleet. And I asked him what fleet was. He said, well, every budget line item has to bear some of the responsibility for the vehicles that the forest has. So they wind up with about $200,000 for maintenance of the road. And just to give you an example, to coat a section of a mile of road properly and thick enough to make a difference would cost $10,000. So they're not in any position to repair any of these roads. All they can do is keep some of the better roads from deteriorating further. The more gravel you can put on a road, the harder you can pack it, the less runoff and the less soil movement. And since I've run over time, I think I'll stop here.
Thank you, David. That was a great introduction to the roads. We're going to have some questions right after Becca. And Becca, you can go ahead and try to share your screen. I think I have the right. Yep. So Becca Risser is with us today. She has been the executive director of the Soque River Watershed Association, SRWA, since 2018. Wow, I can't believe it's been that long. SRWA's mission is to protect and restore the Soque River, its tributaries and watershed. Their projects and initiatives now prevent over 5,500 tons of sediment from entering the Soque each year and have resulted in the entire Soque watershed being removed from the Georgia EPD's list of impaired waters for fecal coliform. Prior to joining SRWA, Becca worked as a naturalist at Alachee Nature Science Center. She also worked as an industrial pollution fellow at Chattahoochee Riverkeeper and as a researcher studying nutrient transport and retention in hill slopes in Alaska. She grew up here in Lawrenceville, Georgia, enjoying the forests and streams of North Georgia. Welcome, Becca.
All right, thank you. So I hope my screen is sharing to all of you. It looks like it is. So thank you, Andrew, for that great introduction. For those of you who may not be familiar with us or with the Soque watershed in particular, the Soque is a part of the Upper Chattahoochee watershed. It's completely contained within Habersham County, and it accounts for about 1/6 of the inflow to Lake Lanier. So it's a relatively small but important watershed. And like Andrew said, a lot of our work in the past has centered around some of the bacteria listings for this Soque watershed, but we've also always been involved with sediment issues in the stream and trying to address them through many, many farm projects. We've worked on over 50 farms at this point, working on livestock exclusions and stream crossings, lots and lots of fencing. We've also done quite a number of stream bank restorations and more urban stormwater projects, such as permeable pavers. We even have done a couple dirt road rehabs, usually as part of our work with farmers. And of course, a tremendous amount of education. And we really enjoy and prefer to do the long-term work as much as we can. If we successfully stabilize a stream bank and stop the stream bank from collapsing into the stream, that can be a effort that pays dividends for years and years and years. But today, since where I always like to start in talking about streams is talking about how incredibly lucky we have gotten in the Southern Appalachians to have such a tremendous variety of life. To give just a few of the highlights, we are spoiled with an incredible diversity of organisms here. Half of the 850 freshwater species in the US and Canada can be found in our region. A tremendous number of mussel species, huge diversity of salamander species, and an incredible abundance. And the list sort of goes on: crayfish, turtles in the southeast. This is just an incredibly rich area to be living in and appreciating. And many, many of these organisms live on stream bottoms, which is going to be sort of a highlight of what we're going to be talking about today. So the stream bottom is all of the pebbles, the cobbles, the boulders that we find on the bottom of streams. It's the ecological region that contains a tremendous amount of the life that lives in streams. There's lots and lots of critters that live at least part of their lives on stream bottoms. So some of them will be very familiar to you, like crayfish, others perhaps less so. I apologize if I'm, start my video. I'm not sure, sorry, I had a strange notification come, but some of these will be less familiar to you, like the water penny, which is found only in streams with a quite high water quality. Also, perhaps more familiar things like hellgrammites. Let's see. I apologize if I'm flipping through a little bit too quickly for you to catch all of these. But the final one is mussels, which we'll come back to later as a particularly unique and important example of some of the organisms that live in on the bottoms of our streams. So, and even more creatures rely on the bottoms for particular parts of their life cycle. For example, there's plenty of fish that eat creatures that live on the benthos, around the benthic zone. Fish lay eggs at the bottoms of streams, certainly salamanders too, turtles. And in fact, the impact of the stream as a whole and the benthic zone in particular extends even out of the stream and into the forest. So there have been some fascinating studies that have been done showing the extent of the connection between the streams and the forest that surrounds them. 44% of the budgets of the annual food budgets of fishes derives from terrestrial insects. 20% of the budget, the food budget of organisms like birds, but also bats and spiders rely heavily on adult aquatic insects that emerge from the stream. And those immature phases, the larvae and the nymphs of those insects, live on the rocks and the wood that exists on the stream bottoms. And when some of the manipulative experiments where streams have been artificially separated from forests by using mesh greenhouses, they found or impressive decreases in the number of organisms, or the number of terrestrial organisms found in neighboring forests as they leave for other areas. Also, so suffice to say that the benthic zone might be one of the most important and fascinating parts of the stream. Not all stream bottoms or streams look alike, and that is completely normal. Sediment is a natural part of these stream systems. What is less natural is when humans start having a big impact on the sediment load that arrives in streams. So we're certainly used to seeing Piedmont streams like this one on the left, much less gradient, much quieter, fewer pools and riffles, more fine sediments on the bottom, versus mountain streams like this one that have bigger cobbles, boulders, and we would not expect at all to see the same kinds of organisms living in them. In this picture on the right, you'll notice there's a hellbender in the foreground, and that's a species that no matter, even if humans never were here, or if we went back in time, we would simply never see that particular species living in a stream that looks like the one on the left. So with that in mind, I wanted to give the very briefest of a primer in fluvial geomorphology. This is a fascinating topic that you can read a lot more about, but suffice to say that these two streams are always going to be different. Mountain streams have high gradients, they're very steep, they tend to have small sediment supply, often because their watersheds are quite small. They have very flashy hydrology. I think the Conasauga is an area that is famous for this, but it's true of any of our mountain streams, that they can change very quickly from base flow to very, very high flows. And that change, that frequency of high flows moves a lot of the finer sediments downstream and results in them having a larger sediment caliber, bigger cobbles and boulders, whereas Piedmont streams tend to have lower gradient, larger sediment supplies, bigger watersheds, more feeder streams that are supplying sediment to them, and less flashy hydrology. And here is just a graphic that's sort of showing that we do see increasing sediment caliber, and how we can have very, very many different sort of looks of streams, and how sediment supply, as you'll see going across the top, really impacts the appearance of these streams, and therefore impacts the kinds of organisms that are able to live in them. So we've already heard quite a bit about forest roads. Certainly the rest of a lot of other sources are less commonly found in our forests, but I just wanted to briefly note that there are many sources of sediment throughout our watersheds. Collapsing stream banks, construction, agriculture can contribute sediment, and certainly forest clearing and forest harvest practices also have an impact on sediment supply to our watersheds. So, why is excess sediment a problem? There are two main aspects to it. One is suspended sediment and the other is deposited sediment, and the one tends to turn into the other as stream flows change. But we'll start with suspended sediment. And as for what it does, it first makes your stream look like this, really aesthetically displeasing. And while the sediment remains suspended in the water column, it reduces visibility for fish seeking food and places to live. And that disadvantages a lot of fish species. And again, as I said, the different streams have different amounts of natural suspended sediment, different natural turbidity levels. You can sort of think about this in a trout versus catfish way. The trout tend to be visual predators. They are adapted to clearer streams, whereas catfish hunt much more based on touch and smell, and are quite well adapted to live in very muddy environments. Sight predators end up being disadvantaged in these kinds of waters. So the sediment also can do damage to fish gills and filter feeding apparatus of invertebrates. It can overwhelm filter feeders, including mussels. Mussels have an amazing ability to clean sediment out of our streams, but when they are exposed to too high of levels, they can essentially choke on it, and we can lose populations of mussels that way that would otherwise be helping continue to keep our streams clean. Also, suspended sediment tends to increase water temperature because cloudy water absorbs more heat. And finally, it potentially can decrease oxygen in our waters. So this is more common in streams or bodies of water that rely more on algae and plants in the streams to produce dissolved oxygen, and less in our mountain streams. And nonetheless, it can have that impact as well. So here you can just sort of see the graphic showing that as turbidity increases and the length of time freshwater fish are exposed to it increases, we end up with more and more severe consequences for them. So certainly it's a real problem. Fortunately, most of our problems with suspended sediment are episodic. If most species can survive occasional encounters with high turbidity levels, and in fact are adapted to that. But as we start getting more frequent events and longer lasting events, a lot of times the longer lasting ones are not so much construction related as they are animals in the stream. So cattle, sometimes dredging creates high turbidity levels for very extended periods of time. But that moves us on to the other consequence of high turbidity levels in our streams, and that's when we start getting deposited sediments. So as the speed of water flow and the water levels decrease, you end up with a lot of what was suspended or what was moved into the stream settling on stream bottoms. And that tends to have some often longer term and more serious consequences for our streams. It changes the benthic structure of the stream bed. Coarse substrates such as gravel and boulders are replaced or smothered by sand and silt. Often these creatures that live on stream bottoms are relying on the interstitial space between rocks to live and hide. Any of you who've been out in streams know that if you want to find amazing creatures in streams, one of the first and best places to start looking is underneath rocks and attached to wood. But when those rocks start disappearing and you get more and more sand instead, you lose habitat niches for these animals. That's certainly where macroinvertebrates tend to cling and be found. This can also happen more directly and smother creatures like macroinvertebrates that aren't able to move very well, and smother eggs rather than just removing the habitat niche. So for example, here we've got some salamander eggs underneath a rock. You can tell that there's a lot of fine sediments in this stream, but there's still space underneath the rocks for the animal, for this two-line salamander to get under there and lay some eggs. And I'll pause for just a moment and acknowledge that a lot of these photographs are from Todd Pearson, who's a new professor at Kennesaw State. As his watermark on a lot of them is very light, but if there's a great picture of a salamander in here, it's probably his. All right, and you can see just how important, there, you can see just how important this not smothering aspect is by looking at the behavior of fish. So I think I've lost my screen temporarily, but I am trying to reconnect. So I'll give it a sec and see whether it comes back. Okay, I think I'm getting it back. There we go. All right, so fish behavior. Certain kinds of fish make nests. So here we're seeing a chub in the upper left. Chubs build nests on the bottom of streams by stacking rocks that they pick up with their mouths. These elevated nests increase the amount of water flow through the nests and decrease the chances of smothering. So they need this good water flow through them, because the fish eggs and salamander eggs need to breathe. They need to have water flow, carry more dissolved oxygen to them, and carry waste away from the eggs. So the chubs build these elevated nests. When you're talking about fish nests, they're usually called redds in most species. And in the true spirit of sharing, our more colorful picture here has lots and lots of minnow and shiner species gathering around that red. So even though the chubs are the ones that build these, they get used by many other fish species. And these are a really neat feature of our streams that you ought to be able to see in just about any stream around here in the spring. So they're a common sight. It may even be more apparent in some more urban streams where a pile of rocks really stands out against a heavily sedimented bottom. So, oh, there we go. Okay, so the scale of this problem, sediment sources are really widespread. When we as an organization were dealing with problems like fecal bacteria in the Soque, it was a little bit of an easier, in some ways, challenge to address because the sources were pretty discrete. They were certain farms and city sewer systems. Sediment comes from all over the place, and it tends to be a more persistent problem. When you fix a sewer leak, your levels of fecal bacteria in the streams recover very, very quickly. Even when you stabilize a source of erosion, the problems tend to persist in streams. So one example of how they are so persistent is the sediment that settles in one stream reach will tend to be remobilized by high flows and just move on to another stream reach. So we keep sort of encountering or re-inflicting this problem on our streams again and again as it moves downstream. In fact, 42% of the stream sections that the state EPD has assessed for some kind of water quality problems are presumed to be impaired due to sediment. That's because whenever they look at stream sections where they are not finding the types and the number of macroinvertebrates or fish species that they expect to find, the default assumption is that it's due to sediment, and it's almost always a good one. So just to give an example from our own watershed, we've had particular problems here with a tributary called Chastain Branch. It's very near the Okie Mountain ORV trails. And many years ago, some of the trails which were very, very, very close to this stream, really only 25 feet in some cases, were relocated farther away. But attempts that we've sponsored through Trout Unlimited and the Georgia DNR to restore habitat for brook trout and reintroduce native brook trout to that stream were not successful. And the same reintroduction attempt was carried out in quite a number of other streams in the region. This just happened to be the one in the Soque watershed. And this was one of, I think, the only one that was so completely unsuccessful because of the amount of sediment that had been sort of inflicted on this stream over a number of years. And finally, always worthwhile, even though I know my audience here is plenty concerned about streams for their own sake and for the sake of the organisms that live in them. But this is an important problem for humans and for its economic impacts as well. Excess sediment sort of directly endangers water supplies, and it also long-term endangers them when it fills reservoirs that we rely on to hold enough drinking water for us. Dredging reservoirs, especially older ones that were not designed to be dredged, is extremely expensive. And it also causes our local governments to start thinking about developing new reservoirs, which is its own little nightmare for preserving habitat. And it also is a continual frustration for people who have properties that are on reservoirs when it fills in coves and reduces property values, turns places like our own local Habersham Mills Lake into something much more like a swamp than like a lake. And finally, erosion in general costs a huge amount of money to the United States. A lot of this is in its cost to farmers as they lose topsoil and are faced with increasing their use of fertilizer to compensate for that. But a lot of this is also in its cost to water supplies and to navigation. Oh, and I should have mentioned that this aerial view that I was showing, and I'll flip back so you can see it a little better, is of the Chesapeake Bay. And you can see how sediment, even in this case, it's not from, we can't see where it starts in this watershed, but a few tributaries and even a source well up in a watershed can have impacts all the way into the ocean. And of course, the Gulf of Mexico, I think, is an equally famous example of the impact of erosion and the corresponding eutrophication, the excess nutrients that comes along with it. And I think that was all I had to say. Andrew had a few links that I'd asked him to share. One of them is our website, if anyone is interested in seeing more of what we do. Another one is on sort of primer and fluvial geomorphology. And the final one, if any of you are really interested in the amazing organisms that live in streams, there's a relatively new film that has come out, clips of which you can see through that Vimeo link, called Hidden Rivers of Southern Appalachia, which focuses right on our area, and it's an amazing look beneath the waters for a perspective that we rarely get to see from our vantage point as humans walking along trails. So I think that's it.
What a great image to end on. I could stare at that for about 20 more minutes. Wow.
All Todd Pearson.
Thank you, Becca. That was great. She was describing how difficult it is to give a short presentation without really knowing who your audience is. And I totally agree, but I thought she did a great job of kind of going over general, basic, but also some stuff that we can do some research on. So thank you. Y'all, if y'all have any questions for either one of the presenters, now's the time to kind of think of them, and you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask them if you see fit. I think I'll take that risk. Real quickly, I'm just gonna launch a quick poll to get you to press a button or two. Just very oversimplified questions. Was this presentation what you expected? And do you feel more motivated to speak up for your public lands after watching this presentation? If you don't mind, go ahead and answering those questions, yes or no, and then I'll read out some questions, or you can ask some questions here. Does anyone have any questions on their mind?
David, has anybody looked at the sediment load and quantified it or studied it in the Chattahoochee from these roads?
Was that directed to me?
Yes, David, it's Kathy. I was just wondering if anybody has studied it and quantified it, or whether it's just visual. You go up there and you just see all the muck and the stuff.
I'm unaware of any thorough study of the effects of sedimentation off of Forest Service roads on the Chattahoochee. What I will tell you is that if you happen to be out in the mountains when there's a heavy downpour, it's astonishing how far the sediment loads run off down the side of the mountains. And oftentimes they may only reach a headwater stream, but then the sediment rests in a headwater stream, and the next downpour that comes along moves them further downstream. And eventually they wind up quite a ways downstream. And if a headwater stream is heavily impacted by failing roads or ATV activity, or Jeepsters as I call them, you might be dealing with that sediment load further downstream for 10, 15, 20 years. Every time it rains, it moves it further down the road, or further down the stream, I should say. But as far as trying to quantify what sediment came from where, that'd be a pretty massive task. And I'm unaware of, Becca might know more about it than I would.
Yeah, well, what I would say is that it is a tremendous task, and sediment, it's one of the most difficult things for us to mention, because as David said, it tends to be episodic. So usually, most of the time when you're out in the forest, you won't see very much sediment moving towards streams. It won't be happening. It happens primarily during large rainstorms. That can be 99–98% of the sediment movement occurring during those very brief events. So there's a whole lot of timing in managing to capture even one water sample. We have used, and there certainly are automatic samplers that can be triggered by rainfall, and those are helpful in some cases. As you start getting to bigger streams, there's a difference in the amount. Well, there's many parts of that sediment transportation. So I really didn't touch on this, but in addition to what's actually suspended in the water column, which you might measure in a water sample, that you could either measure turbidity, or you could run it through a filter and collect the solids out of it. There's also bed load. So there is a significant portion of sediment going into the streams that's never actually dissolved or suspended. It's just rolling along the bottom. So to capture both of those, there are sampling protocols, but the good ones are really hard to do well. Then you start getting into the number of different streams, remobilizing old sediment versus new sediment. And to me, when I get around to what is really important, or what are the ways that are worth measuring it, I often encourage people to do macroinvertebrate or fish studies. So there are some relatively simple protocols for quantifying macroinvertebrates that are present in streams, and those tend to be quite sensitive. Those macroinvertebrates tend to be quite sensitive to excess sediment. So that makes a way to measure, in some ways, the impact that a lot of people most care about, rather than trying to measure something that in some ways is very hard to understand. And I'll also add that even if you've gotten an accurate measurement of how much sediment is in a stream, there is also the problem of of how long does that pulse persist to actually getting to, for example, a tonnage of how much sediment has washed off the landscape. It's just kind of a nightmare of something to measure. And I'm sorry for talking that long, but it really is a continuing pain and annoyance to figure out a good way to get a grasp on it.
Any other questions? We've got.
Yeah, I've got a question, Andrew, but I've talked enough. If anyone else has a question, let them go first.
We just had a question from Sue about, so I can see the sedimentation from poorly maintained roads is a big problem for our forest streams. I also see that David has spent years trying to get roads gated and closed. What is the single best action that I can make as an individual to help get the Forest Service to deal with these road issues? David?
Well, unfortunately, the only thing I could think of is to write emails to the district ranger and complain about the condition of the roads, and to recommend closing offending roads if they're not critical transportation hubs. I mean, obviously there are roads that we all use in the Forest Service that are going to have to remain open. And the trick is to shut down the ones that aren't needed, and certainly to bring an end to the mud bogging pastime. And how Forest Service roads are open to any legal, highway legal vehicle in Georgia. What that means, if the state of Georgia will sell you a license plate, you can ride on it. So that unfortunately means all the Jeeps convoys that you see riding around with their rough tread tires are legal, and there's no way to get them off it. And how you could educate those people not to mud bog the sides of the roads, I just don't know. They seem to be beyond education. You would think an adult would know better to begin with. But all I can think of is, in terms of complaining about that stuff, is to write or email, email the district ranger and complain about the fact that the road is eroding and sending a lot of sediment downstream somewhere. I mean, it's going to wind up in a stream eventually. It may not wind up after the first rain event, but after the second or third, it will.
Thank you. Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that, some things that I've done personally is change my habit when I'm on Forest Service roads. I try not to widen them. If I see a puddle or a bad rut spot, if you continue to go to the left, to the right of that, you're going to start widening the road. So if possible, I try to take where the original roadbed was intended to be, and then also try not to ride the roads after a good rain event. I feel like it does loosen up a lot more sediment after rain and when it's wet. Okay, well, if there's no more questions, I'm going to turn it over to Anne if she's still here.
I
Go for it.